Hey everybody, it's Joel Williams and Chase Elleby coming to you today with a new video where we're going to talk about wrongful death claims and estate-based claims and the ins and outs of all that, how to bring them. So why don't you get us started, Chase, by going over the difference between the two?
Sure. So generally when someone passes away due to someone else's negligence, there's two claims. There's the estate claim and then there's the actual wrongful death claim. So the estate claim is usually brought by the administrator or the executor of the estate, and they can seek damages for things like medical bills, funeral costs, things like that. I typically like to think of it as damages that you can collect or seek rather when that person is alive, right? This is not a real fun topic to talk about, but I guess an example I'll give is if there's a car crash and someone goes to the hospital, lives for 2 weeks in the hospital, and then ends up passing away, well, the estate will have a claim for those damages in the 2 weeks that the person was alive. Things like fear, shock, fright of being in the wreck, conscious pain and suffering, things like that. The other claim you have is a wrongful death claim, which is a statutory claim that's brought typically by the heirs or the family members of the person who's passed away. And what you can seek for the wrongful death damages are the full value of the person's life.
Yep. And it's the full value of the person's life to them.
Correct.
Which is sometimes a very difficult thing to prove. So when we're trying to prove those damages, we have to bring in friends and family members to talk about how much the person who passed away's enjoyed life, how much they valued life, and that sort of thing.
That's right.
Another thing to think about with estate-based claims and wrongful death claims is who has the right to bring the claim to begin with. So for an estate-based claim, it's going to be the executor or the administrator of the estate. So typically the executor is going to be the person who is in charge of the estate if there is a will, and the administrator would be whoever the court appoints if there is no will. Now it gets a little bit trickier with wrongful death claims, and we're going to go over 4 different types of people who can bring wrongful death claims or who have the potential to have the ability to bring wrongful death claims. But please understand that this is a very basic explanation of this because there are treatises after treatises and classes in law school dealing with this very subject, and there's exception after exception after exception to all of these.
All right, and it's going to be specific to Georgia as well. Most states are similar, but Georgia has a specific code section that discusses who is eligible to bring the wrongful death claim.
Yep, and it's changed over the years, but as we sit here right now in August of 2023, the wrongful death claim, the first person who has priority and who is usually bringing the claim is the surviving spouse. So if the person who dies has a surviving husband or wife or legal partner, then that person is the one who gets to bring the claim. If there is no surviving spouse, then the person or persons who get to bring the claim are the surviving children. And that can be adopted children or biological children, either or all of the above. Third is the parents. If there's no spouse, there's no children, then the parents can bring the claim. We most often see this if it's a minor child who passes away and then the parents are bringing it, but sometimes it happens with adults too. And then finally, if there's no surviving spouse, no surviving children, and no parents, then whoever the administrator or executor of the state is can then bring the wrongful death claim. Now, it's important to remember, at least in the state of Georgia, that when a surviving spouse brings a wrongful death claim and there are surviving children, then the spouse does have complete and total authority to settle the case, but that spouse also has a duty to the surviving children to act in good faith. And that's important because the spouse has to share in any recovery proceeds with the children. One unique aspect of Georgia law is that the spouse, if there are children, the spouse will always get at least 1/3 of the ultimate recovery. So if there are 10 children, then those 10 children would share in 2/3 of the recovery and the spouse would get 1/3, right? Yeah. And this, we could go so far deep in the briar patch with this, it's not even funny, but who gets what percentages really just depends on, how many kids there are in the spouse. But ultimately, just remember that if you have a loved one that passes away due to the negligence of someone else, the order, at least in the state of Georgia, of the people that can bring the claim is surviving spouse, surviving children, parents, and then the administrator or executor of the estate.
Yeah, and that's right. I think it's also important to just highlight too, like what you just talked about. If the if the spouse gets, say the husband passes away, and the wife is the one bringing the claim. If the wife gets a recovery, she gets at least a third. If there are more than 2 children, if there are, let's say, just 1 other children, then they split it equally. Mm-hmm. So, but again, it's very specific to the statute in Georgia, and so check whichever state you're in. It could vary a little bit. So
yeah, it can vary a lot because some states, like last I checked, Alabama was the only thing you could recover for wrongful death was punitive damages.
Right.
So some states have laws that don't make a whole lot of logical sense, but they are what they are. So make sure whatever state you're in, you're checking those specific laws.
That's right. All right, so the next question then becomes, how do we bring a claim if it's a wrongful death case or an estate case, right? So it's similar to just any other real, injury case. You start off first with hopefully making a demand against the insurance company or the at-fault party to try to get the case resolved that way. If you can, then you bring a lawsuit, right? And then going back to the order of who we talked about, who can bring the claim, that will be the person who actually brings the lawsuit on behalf of the decedent against whoever the at-fault party is. And that at-fault party could be a person or a company, whatever it may be for that specific situation. So again, it's usually you try to get it resolved through a demand, meaning pre-suit. If we can't get it resolved, then we have to file a lawsuit, which again, you're getting into discovery, depositions, experts, and trial, which makes it that much longer.
Yeah. See the other 250 so odd videos that we have about that process. Right. But so you can make the pre-suit demands. If that doesn't get the case settled, you have to go through the formal litigation process. In wrongful death cases, I think it's important. It's important in every case, but especially in wrongful death cases, to make sure that you or your attorney is extra diligent in securing all the evidence and talking to all the witnesses. And the obvious reason why that's important is because the person who passed away isn't there to tell their part of the story. So we have to rely on direct evidence, circumstantial evidence, eyewitness testimony, and all that to say what happened. So even if it's something as simple as who ran the red light, if somebody passes away, then we're going to need those extra witnesses to come in and testify as to exactly what happened. So when you're faced with that, it is usually the last thing on your mind to deal with securing evidence and witnesses because you just lost a loved one. And that is 100% understandable. But it's also very important to secure that evidence early while memories are fresh and evidence is still available. So sometimes in those situations, if you can reach out to an attorney and get them on board early, then that will relieve some of that stress because the attorney's office can then go and secure all that evidence and contact all the witnesses for you while you're going through the grieving process. So just keep that in mind that, when you don't have the victim's testimony, then that other evidence becomes even more important.
All right. And not only that, not only the evidence for the incident itself and proving liability, but you also need witnesses, and you talked about this a little bit earlier, witnesses to come in and talk about the person who passed away, right? Because it's the value of the life as to that person, and you prove that by bringing in witnesses, family, friends, coworkers, and things like that. I mean, we've heard of wrongful death cases where you can bring in 30 or 40 witnesses to talk about the person who passed away so the jury can get a good sense of who this person was, what they were like in the community, and that sort of thing. So the next thing we'll talk about is sort of negotiating with the insurance companies when you have these types of cases. A lot of that, and we've got other videos you can look at or watch rather that deal with insurance companies and negotiations and things like that. A lot of that, of course, just depends, quite frankly, on how much coverage there is, right? If it's not a lot of coverage and you're dealing with a wrongful death case, you're almost always going to get the case resolved, meaning you're going to get it resolved that by the insurance company tendering their limits. But there's a couple of things you need to do to make sure that you are protecting your clients, but also ensuring that there isn't any other insurance that's out there, right? So for a wrongful death case, a lot of times what we'll do, if we say we get a deck page back from the at-fault insurance company, and it's a State Farm auto insurance policy.
Yeah, and the deck page is just the page that tells you how much insurance is available.
Right, how much coverage, correct. So if we find out there's only $50,000 worth of coverage, well, we might send an affidavit to State Farm to say, get the insurer to attest, and you, State Farm, attest that there's no other insurance that's out there. So we want to confirm how much coverage there is. But also, too, when you're dealing with estate claims and wrongful death claims, there's certain advantages to resolving a wrongful death claim as opposed to an estate claim. One example would be, let's say the estate claim has, a $3 million hospital bill because the person was in a bad wreck and they had to be in the hospital for 3 months. Well, if you bring an estate claim and you get a recovery for the state, well, the hospital might try to come and collect against that recovery. But if it's just a wrongful death claim, then the wrongful death claim goes to the heirs, as we talked about earlier, based on the statute. And that's something that you have a lot better chance of arguing, hey, hospital or whatever, you don't get this because this isn't a state recovery. This is simply a wrongful death recovery. Mm-hmm. So there's certain, ways that, or certain, considerations you need to have when negotiating with insurance companies when you have these types of cases.
Yeah. And I think another thing to think about when you're negotiating with insurance companies regarding wrongful death cases is in the situation where there is a 7 or 8 figure insurance policy, meaning $1 million or more, I can't think of many lives that are worth less than $1 million.
Right.
And when you take that away, then it's obviously, you take a life away, it's obviously a very large monetary damage case. But the more that you're asking an insurance company to pay, the more likely they are to make your life difficult to recover that money. They're going to want to hold on to it. They're going to want to fight you a little harder. And so in wrongful death cases, they can't take your client's deposition. You have to have those friends and family that can speak for the person that passed away. So sometimes prior to filing a lawsuit, if we're trying to get a case resolved pre-suit, it's helpful to sometimes do video statements of friends or family. Or if you can't do that, do written statements from friends or family that you can send along with the demand to the insurance company, so the adjuster at the insurance company has some idea of what kind of person this was that passed away, and just bring that human element into it so they understand how significant the loss really is. But yeah, so another thing to think about, and this is very important in wrongful death cases, is the statute of limitations.
It's important in all cases.
In all cases, yeah, absolutely. But it's also important in wrongful death cases because in wrongful death cases, in the state-based cases, it can get a little murkier because in the average personal injury lawsuit, or in the average personal injury case, there is a time, a deadline that says in X number of years from after the date of the loss. So it says a car wreck that happens on August what is today? 13th?
Right.
August 13th, 2023. I don't even know what year it is right now. But if you have a wreck that happens today, the laws of the state that you're in are going to set a ultimate deadline from when the lawsuit has to be filed, or it's barred forever. So sometimes it's 1 year, sometimes it's 2 years. Some states have even longer, but it's state specific. In wrongful death and estate-based claims, there generally are deadlines that'll say 2 years from the date of death, you have to file the lawsuit. But there are a myriad of exceptions to that. So in medical malpractice cases, for example, if it's a misdiagnosis case, it may mess up that timeline, and you have to go back and look at specific deadlines for med mal cases and then compare that to when the injury or when the missed condition was discovered and then calculate it from there. If an estate hasn't been set up for the deceased person, then it may extend the deadline further, but there is an ultimate deadline called a statute of repose that you cannot go past that. If the at-fault party passed away, say it's a car wreck and they died in the car wreck, if their estate hasn't been set up, that may extend the deadline some. If there's a criminal investigation, it may extend the deadline some. I tell you all that because if we went into all those exceptions in this video, we would be here for 3 hours, and you don't want to listen to us talk for 3 hours.
Right.
So the reason I bring that up is if you are in a situation where you've lost a loved one due to the negligence of somebody else, all of the statutory procedures for who has the right to bring the claim the differences between the estate-based claim, what can be recovered by the estate, the full value of the life and the wrongful death claim, how long you have to bring the claim, the effort that needs to be put into finding the witnesses and the evidence and all of that. It can be very overwhelming at a time in your life that your emotions are going everywhere, and it can be very confusing and overwhelming. So I say all that to highly, highly recommend, if you are faced with that situation, to find an attorney. And I'm not saying you got to call us, just find someone that's reputable in your area and get in touch with them so they can take over the case and take the legal aspects off of your plate when your priorities should be elsewhere.
Yeah, and then you at a minimum call and speak to an attorney. You don't have to necessarily hire someone right off the bat, but 100% call, speak with someone, find out, what you need to know about your specific situation. Because like Joel said, it can be very, very complicated, very, very confusing. So I think you're doing yourself a disservice if you don't at least call.
Yeah, and most attorneys like us that do personal injury and wrongful death cases, they're going to offer free initial consultations. So it's going to be easy to find an attorney that'll talk to you and kind of go over your options with you. So you're not going into it blind, and you can at least educate and inform yourself about what your options are and whether you want to get an attorney.
That's right.
So I think that about wraps it up for estate-based claims and wrongful death. You got anything else to add?
No, like you said, it's a heavy topic. We could talk about it forever, but I think we did a good job kind of highlighting everything to consider. So.
Yep. Okay. All right. Well, we appreciate your time today. And if this video has been helpful, give us a thumbs up, hit that subscribe button. Otherwise, we will see you next week.